It's Friday. That means it's time for Friday with Friends, where I bring in someone who's remotely interesting, who I remotely consider to be my friend. Ari Hoffman is here this week. Hello, Ari.
I am so honored to be considered a remote friend. I feel so special right now. You know how to build a guest up before that interview there, Brandy. Thank
Hey,
you.
I also called you remotely interesting.
That's fair. That's a fair point. Remotely interesting. I'll take that one. That's one of the nicer things they say about me. So thank you for that.
No, I consider you absolutely a friend, very supportive. You've been great to me, and also very interesting. For people who don't know who you are, give them the Cliff Notes of Ari Hoffman's life.
Sure. Well, I'm a talk radio host. So I don't do anything in the Cliff Notes version, but I'll try to keep it brief. Basically, I moved out to Seattle 18 years ago to be near my wife's family, and I love it here. I love that I can take a boat out anytime I want. I love that I could go skiing anytime I want. I love everything about the climate here. But then when I was running several businesses, one was an event rental company, one was a construction company, I realized how bad things were getting. I did a lot of volunteer work in the Jewish community, and we started having a lot of problems with the homeless, both at the synagogue and in the cemeteries I used to manage. And that led me down a path to politics. And then when COVID hit, unfortunately, it really took a toll on my businesses, and I decided to do a career change. And luckily, it all worked out where now I ended up, in talk radio, which is the best job I think I've ever had since I was a water skiing instructor as a teenager. And I absolutely love it. I should have done this 20 years ago. And I'm really where I feel I belong. And it's great to have a job where you can go to work every single day with a smile on your face and not be upset when you leave at the end of the day.
Yeah, you've had it's interesting, and it's all happened in the course of a couple years. Like business owner hurt by the pandemic, political candidate, into talk radio, and I think and it's funny because, as you know, I'm also friends with your competition, Dory Monson, who I've also had on Fridays with Friends, and so I feel stuck in the middle of these two really good radio hosts in the competing time slots, and I just think it's very funny.
Well, I don't think of it as competition because what they do is they go back and forth during commercials. So it's like, oh, he's on commercial, we're going to the other guy. Our commercials are timed at different times. And also the other thing is like, if not for people like Dory, I wouldn't have gotten this opportunity. Todd Herman's the first one to put me on the radio. Jason Rance had me on during my campaign all the time. Dory, with that whole brouhaha over an RV getting towed to a city council member's house. I mean, that really raised my profile a lot in an interesting way, even though I had nothing to do with it. And every single one of them called, emailed, everything to wish me best of luck. So I don't really feel like any of us are competing. I feel like we're all fighting the same fight. I think we're all on the same side. And I never think of it as competition. I think of it as more like, just like you say, Fridays with Friends. I think these are my friends. These are the people I work with. And even though we're on different networks, that's how I always viewed our industry. Maybe I'm naive. Maybe I'm wrong that way, but that's how I always think about it.
Well, it's been fascinating to see I mean, you're very good at what you do, and you've only been doing it for a couple years. And I think, gosh, what if you had been doing radio for 25 years? Just where you'd be at right now. But tell people kind of what your show is about. What is the mission of your show?
Sure. Like you, it was really always about common sense. It was always about what common sense things can we do. And I was kind of shocked recently when we were getting our demographic breakdown of who's listening to the show and stuff. It's about 50-50 Democrats, Republicans. I was kind of surprised by that. And a lot of Democrats reach out to me all the time and say, Ari, it's such common sense ideas. How come you're not a Democrat? And I go, you listen to the show? I mean, you sure about that? Maybe you want to listen a little harder, but I come from a place of my parents actually helped get Reagan elected. And I was a Democrat in college. And that broke my father's heart, absolutely broke his heart. My mother was one who voted for Clinton. That broke my father's heart. I mean, there's all these things that went on there. So we come from a really diverse political background. And it was really 9/11 that changed my worldview. I was in New York when it happened. It really changed my whole worldview, got me thinking about things a little bit differently. And I really try to always approach it from the common sense angle. And when people come on my show who I disagree with, I always hated when I used to listen to talk radio, hearing people yell over each other. That made me change the station. Some people may think it's good radio, but I think it's boring and obnoxious. So when they come on my show, I'll ask them the questions. But even if I had Jay Inslee on my show, I'm not going to yell at Jay Inslee, even though I can't stand him with the fire of a thousand suns. I would rather have a conversation with the guy and ask him, hey, why'd you do this? And let him give his response. I'm not going to talk over somebody. So I've always really tried to appeal to as many people as I can, because that's how you win more friends. That's how you win the battle. That's how you win the argument, by having more people go, okay, we agree on 80% of these things and the other 20% are outside of our control, or at least can we find common ground?
Wow, you just casually skipped over two very important things. Your parents helped get Reagan elected. What were they doing?
So here I'm about to date myself. My parents were working on Reagan's campaign. This is all I know is my mother is still mad she couldn't go to the inaugural ball because she was pregnant with me at the time. I don't know
Oh,
how that factored in, but that's somehow factored that in. I don't really know a lot of what they do, but when I called my father and I was at the Reagan Library, which is a magnificent place, Democrat, Republican, you should go there. It's magnificent. When I was there and I was talking about it with my dad, my family doesn't share that much. I don't know my family medical history. They never share anything. But he said, he said something like, "Oh, those were the times." I'm like, "Well, what'd you do?" "Oh, well, next time you come over, I'll tell you all about it." So you know about as much as I do about what they did.
I love that. And I actually, every Friday we end the show. It's super corny and just old. It's almost indoctrination, but we end the show by reading an important piece of text from American history. I'm reading Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. But last week we did, I don't know if you've ever heard Reagan's speech, A Time for Choosing.
Sure, absolutely.
It just in reading it back, and for people who didn't watch the show last Friday or aren't familiar, it wasn't even a speech he gave for himself. It was for, I think, Barry Goldwater when he was supporting his campaign. This is long before Reagan was even in politics, and so much of what he said in there is perfectly suited for today. This idea of like you can run your life better than the government can. So I always like Reagan stories. He was just such an interesting guy. The other thing you skipped over, you said 9/11 changed your perspective on politics and your worldview. Like, how so?
So when I was living in New York at the time, and I'm New York born and raised, it felt like a violation of my life, and I wasn't even there. A guy in my synagogue was killed. In New York, one of the things in the Jewish community, the Orthodox Jewish community, they have this Jewish volunteer ambulance service called Hatzalah. A lot of guys do it for all the right reasons. A lot of guys do it because they like having fire, the police department sirens on their cars. There's a lot of reasons why people do it, but a lot of my friends were down there. A friend of mine who I'm very, very close with, one of my mentors growing up, actually drove his ambulance in under the towers. And when he got the evacuation order, people were holding on to the side of his ambulance as he was driving out. And the way he described it to me was like that scene in Die Hard with a Vengeance when Bruce Willis is driving the truck through the tunnel and he just sees that darkness behind him. That's how he describes it. My wife, actually, she was very involved with, there's a Jewish custom called Shmirah. What you do is you watch over a body till it's buried. They didn't know who was Jewish, who wasn't. So they set up this thing at the morgue where people for over a year sat there every night saying prayers on a cycle until all these people were buried. I used to pick up my wife from dates from the New York City morgue. It was right near her college. So they had a whole bunch of girls do that. It changed my worldview and the fact that when it first happened, I'm like, oh, it's an airplane accident. Somebody, oh no, there's no way those things were filled with people. I was so naive about it. And I still grew up. I went to school in Israel. I mean, I know about terrorism. We used to say prayers for all the victims of terror in Israel all the time. It's not like I didn't know about these things, but I was just so naive that I didn't believe this kind of evil really existed. Maybe I hadn't been touched by it before. It was always somewhere else, happening to somebody else. And when it really hit home, when you go into the subways in Manhattan right after it happened, and even at 186th Street, where I would get on the subway, 181st Street, where you get on the subway, you could smell something that smelled like burned flesh in the subway tunnels. It was so personal. It was so raw. Everybody was hit by it. That really got me thinking, changing my worldview. I voted for Al Gore. And then after that, I'm like, wow, I'm really glad the other guy's in the White House. And mind you, first term Bush is very different than second term Bush. I wasn't a big fan of second term Bush, even though I voted for him. But it changed my whole worldview just on that, just basing on national security alone. And everything else really came out of that. And even though I had friends who were volunteer firefighters, police department, it was more like, oh, you're a bunch of posers. Then it became, oh, you're actually like doing this for all the right reasons. You don't just want the keys. You don't just want the siren on top of your car and all that. And it completely shifted how I felt about first responders, how I felt about the military, everything. And actually I had a conversation with my dad. I said, I'm joining the Navy because my family's all Navy family. And he goes, no, you're not. And I said, why not? And he goes, we dealt with a lot of anti-Semitism back then. And I go, I'm joining the Navy. My country needs me. And he goes, there's people who need you here. You're doing a lot of stuff with the youth organizations. They need you here. You don't need to go. And I said, I'm going. I said, if my grandfather says I can go, can I go? And he said, yeah, if he says so, with a big smile on his face, knowing exactly what he was going to say. So I called my grandfather. I'm like, Papa, can I go sign up for the Navy? And he goes, no. And I said, why not? And he goes, I fought so you wouldn't have to. And that really stuck with me. But still, my house is like the Seattle Jewish USO. Whenever these guys are coming through town on their ships and stuff, they're always stopping at our place.
That's funny because I've joked that I was Seattle's USO. My friend was in the Navy, and when he got out, he stayed with me and to get back on his feet. And then all his friends, as they got out of the Navy, because they process out near Seattle, they'd come and spend a few days and then head off. So have there been any events? I think it's interesting you bring up 9/11 as sort of a turning point for you ideologically or your worldview. And I always think of, my worldview has changed a lot over the years, and I think it also depends on where you live and the politics. Have there been any events or any things that you can think of since 9/11 that have had any substantial impacts on your worldview?
I think that when I was running for office, I really tried to just approach it from the common sense perspective of what's going to appeal to the most amount of people. And I was naive enough to think that that would carry me through. And unfortunately, and I'm sure you are going to know exactly what I'm talking about. When you pick common sense, there's a lot of people on the far, far, far extremes. And that's the right and the left. So it's that horseshoe theory thing we talk about all the time. The far right is closer to the far left than they are the center. That for them, nothing's ever good enough. And there's no assumption of good at all. One day when I was running for office, I literally got two, I don't remember if they're emails or direct messages, whatever. One saying, I'm never voting for you, you're a Trump supporter. And what's funny is I didn't vote for him the first time. And the second one said, I'm never voting for you, you're too much of a liberal. And it was literally the same day, back to back in my inbox. I'm like, this is crazy. And for some people, it's never enough. But the attacks I got when I was running for office, the vicious ones, the death threats, the everything, were overwhelmingly from the far left. I barely heard from these neo-Nazi white supremacists I've heard so much about. In fact, I'd say some of the more far right groups were sending me messages of support. I'm like, thanks. We're just going to shove that over here and not talk about that. But it was very eye-opening that there's some people who, like they say in the movie The Dark Knight, just want to watch the world burn, and nothing's ever good enough for them. And that was really a turning point for me, where I started becoming more and more conservative because of that. Because I said, well, if they're never going to bend on these things and they don't even want to talk to you on these things, then I have to defend these items. This is my defense area, where if you mess with these items, we're going to have some problems.
Well, one of the things, and I'm sure that you've experienced this as well, is, you try to approach something with common sense, but just because of who you are, any idea, any thought is completely discounted. So, I was the blonde fox lady in town, right? And I feel like you and I and our friends Dory and Jason, we've been vilified as far-right extremists for speaking out about things like police defunding and the issues related to crime. Like, we're these crazy right-wingers, and now what do you see? 2 years after it actually mattered, you've got Bob Ferguson talking about, the crime issues. You've got Jay Inslee coming out and saying that he thinks police defunding isn't a good idea and talking about how we need more police officers. And now everybody's like, oh yeah, good job. Like, thank you for talking. It's like, we've been talking about that stuff for years and we've been vilified for doing it. And I find it incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, let's just go back to our favorite topic, the autonomous zone. So let me make sure I got this right. There were riots in downtown Seattle against police where they burned cop cars, where your security guard had to take away an AR-15 that was taken out of one of those cars. I remember that like it was yesterday. Then they didn't send in the National Guard till it was pretty much over, and they sent them in unarmed. Then there's nights of riots, which lead to an autonomous zone where they abandon a police precinct. The governor says he doesn't know anything about it during the first press conference. Weeks go by, 5 people are shot, 2 people are killed, all of them are black. They don't let the police in that zone at all. Then after that fun, it doesn't even get broken up by the National Guard. And then there's still rioting and stuff that goes on after that. And then he signs anti-police legislation. And then he fires a whole bunch of police officers for not getting the vaccine. And now he's going to come out and say he's never been in support of defunding the police. Spare me. I mean, really.
But I worry, I guess, that part of it is I take it personally, right? It does, and maybe it's because I'm young-ish, right? The vilification that I endured as a mainstream journalist in Seattle for things that I thought were just plain common sense, it did impact me. And less so now, but it did bother me. And now you can just have someone like Jay Inslee at the 11th hour step up and say, oh yeah, I'm not in favor of police defunding. And he's not going to be vilified in the same way. So part of it is that I take it personally. And the other part of it is I know there are voters who are going to fall for it, who, the next election are going to be like, oh yeah, Bob Ferguson, when he's running for governor, oh, he supports the police. He was cracking down on shoplifting. It's like, no, he wasn't, not when it really mattered. So I think it bothers me for both those reasons.
I completely agree. It bothers me too. Like, the reason I hate Jay Inslee, and I don't hate a lot of people, I really don't. I mean, I know I rail against people on the radio, but I don't hate Bob Ferguson. I don't hate Joe Biden. I don't hate Kamala Harris. I don't hate it. I don't hate Barack Obama. I don't hate any of those people. I despise Jay Inslee. Look at where you're sitting right now. You're sitting in this beautiful studio. You had to roll the dice and take a chance of leaving corporate media and building all that up. And is it going to work? Is it not going to work? And thank God you've been very, very successful. And for me, it was, I poured every dime I had into a couple of companies, and they're destroyed now. And it's dumb luck that I got the job I have now. It's dumb luck, or the stars aligning, or God looking out for me, or whatever it is. But a lot of other people weren't so lucky. And he's responsible for that. He is 100% responsible for that. And that's something I just don't let go. And for me, when somebody says, oh, they really like this guy, I mean, I'm not going to rail on some stranger I don't know. I'm not going to get into a Facebook fight. That was stupid stuff. Didn't you grow up and don't realize that's not what you're supposed to do? That's not how human beings talk to each other. But it really bothers me that people are going to forget how many people lost their jobs because of a guy like that. How many people lost these dreams they poured their life's work into, all their savings into. Their kids didn't get to go to school. They talk about education. They lock these kids home, and we know it was a complete disaster. I saw it in my own kids. One of my kids, you started seeing the light go out of his eyes during COVID when he was trapped home all the time. And my kids go to private school. You started seeing that happen. I cannot forgive Jay Inslee for that, for the fact that now he finally came back from summer camp and he was just filled with everything. Even though he's been in school for a year, it just wasn't the same. But he finally came back from summer camp, got to be with his friends, and he's back to himself. So what? It took a year and a half for me to get my son back? That's something I can't forgive.
And for me, it wasn't the fact that Jay Inslee was in this situation where he needed to do stuff to save lives. I've always believed that some of the early decisions were up in the air, like he was, dealing with what he had to deal with in the moment, but the complete lack of not only creativity, but a desire to even attempt creativity to keep businesses open and to try to deal with two crises at once, the economic crisis and the health crisis, I think is what really gets me. I wanted to ask you, I don't want to take up, I know you got a show to put on today.
We're fine. I like how you know.
Show prep. You have been getting these exclusive videos. So Howard Schultz, who's now stepped back into the role of leading Starbucks, he has been having some internal meetings, and you have somehow obtained, I know you won't reveal your source, I'm sure, maybe you will. You've obtained these videos that someone has taken of these internal meetings that talk about what Starbucks is doing to respond to the crime crisis across the country. We discussed one of your videos on the show last week about how they're closing some locations of high crime. So first, where are you getting the videos, Ari?
Well, I'm not going to say that, but I will say it as somebody inside the Starbucks network. How about we put it that way?
Okay,
as opposed to anything else like that. It's not like, well, whatever. That's where I'm going to leave it. Let's just leave it there.
That was a test. I was making sure you were a true journalist and you wouldn't reveal your source.
I don't ever call myself a journalist. So, and besides, I'm still learning this stuff. So yeah, you could have totally hoodwinked me. I wouldn't have known.
What are some of the most fascinating things that you have gleaned from those videos?
The thing for me is two things. One, a reporter reached out to me from California about it. First of all, thank you. You're one of the few people who asked to use it. That was very nice of you to do so. A lot of other people just, oh yeah, we'll slap it up here with no attribution. That's fine. I can deal with it. But this reporter asked me about it and said, do you have the rest of the video? Did they discuss the unions at all? Because some people are trying to make this about, oh, it's Howard Schultz doing union busting. Yesterday, I put up, another 8 or 9 minutes of the video. And in watching the video that I've seen so far, I haven't seen the whole thing. The person told me that unions never came up in the discussion. Nobody asked about it, and they weren't controlling the questions. From what I saw, he was actually surprised a few times by the questions he got. He wasn't expecting them. He wasn't prepared for them. And when you hear these questions about safety, when people are concerned about it, this was nothing about union busting. That might have been convenient. Like the Democrats saying, oh, we could shut down the synagogues and schools and churches and all that kind of stuff at the time. That's convenient for COVID. I don't think that was the plan for COVID. But it was really coming from a place for him of he's concerned about liability. He's concerned about a mass shooting. He's concerned about crime. And don't forget, he hasn't been running Starbucks the past few years when it's been the riots and it's been all the BLM stuff. Now, mind you, he's definitely a progressive, but he's cleaning up the mess. He's like the guys in Men in Black who come in and neuralize you and clean up the site afterwards. He's trying to fix Starbucks. So he's really a guy coming from a place of, I could get my butt sued if some young barista woman who's 18 years old is unlocking a door at 4:30 in the morning and some guy beats the crap out of her, and that's going to be a national story. And then we're going to have real union problems. I mean, look, you've gone to some of these Starbucks. I've gone to some of these Starbucks. They're not in the best neighborhoods. And when I lived in New York, I remember some of these Starbucks. I'm like, you put a Starbucks here? Really? So it's really coming from a place of, they're really concerned about what's going to happen, whether it's a mass shooting or whether it's the crime, but they are dealing with a problem they created themselves. The open bathroom policy, the defund the police movement, all that. They created these problems and now they're dealing with them. So a lot of people are going, you're getting your just desserts. But don't forget, there's a lot of people who are affected by this who work for the company who voted for Donald Trump or voted for whoever else it was and didn't buy into these policies, but it's a job and Starbucks takes care of their employees really well. And they're the ones suffering from this. So this union business, I think, is a distraction. I really do. I looked at the ones they closed. Some of them line up, some of them don't. If they had included all of them, sure. I really don't think there's much to it. I really don't.
Yeah, and as I said on the podcast, the ones that were closed in Seattle that I'm familiar with, no one can disagree that those are no one can say those aren't high crime areas, you know, and so it just demonstrably, had you visited them, you would have understood why those ones are closing. And in those videos, Howard Schultz says more of them are to come. One of the interesting things that I thought in the video is Howard Schultz saying that he's worried personally to speak out or give his personal opinion on anything going on, like on gun control or something, for fear that something he says might make a Starbucks a target. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, that's basically what he said. Yeah.
Do you think that that's a reasonable fear for him to have?
I don't think it's unreasonable given the fact of, let's take Bernie Sanders from that. I don't think Bernie Sanders is responsible for the congressional baseball shooting. I don't think he is. I think he uses a lot of rhetoric. I think Donald Trump uses a lot of rhetoric. I think Joe Biden uses, I think everybody uses rhetoric. I think a crazy person is going to do something crazy. But at the same time, you don't want a crazy person having a journal filled with things if I'm doing this because it's Howard Schultz. I mean, because then people will hang that around him forever. But also, he does have to look out for his employees. And this is a guy who, whatever you say about Howard Schultz, he treats his employees very, very well. They have all these college programs and they have all these medical programs that no other company had back then. He was really a trendsetter and all that. And I truly believe this guy, I've met him once or twice. I truly believe this guy really does care about his employees. I really don't think that's BS. But he's right. But at the same time, I say, you guys took all these political stands when you were the CEO of the company. If you didn't want to get political, then you shouldn't have gotten political. But now you've put yourself in this place where now everybody's expecting you to be political. It's going to be really hard to say, we make coffee. We make expensive, high price, sometimes good, sometimes not good coffee. That's what we do. Leave us alone. But instead, now they're the social justice warriors and everybody's expecting them to be the social justice warriors. And how do you get out of that?
Yeah. And again, I did a commentary on this last week, Starbucks and Amazon. I felt like I was carrying water for them for 2 years, speaking out about the poor treatment of those companies and the vilification of those companies. And then I think, well, they weren't even willing to defend themselves, from the mob. Like, why am I defending Starbucks and Amazon from the mob when they don't even want to defend themselves from the mob? So it's just another silly thing. Well, Ari Hoffman, I appreciate you joining Fridays with Friends. And thanks for being such a good friend. And thanks for being so supportive of me and the podcast, especially at the very beginning. And I do want you to know, I've told you in person, but I do appreciate it.
I'll say this to your audience so they can hear me say it, because maybe not all of them were at that conference you and I had that forum on, but I truly believe there are very few voices left in mainstream media that were ever down the road center. Let's look at this. Let's look at that. When you were over at Fox, there were times I disagreed with you. There were times I agreed with you. You are the most non-biased person I have ever met in media. And I really, truly mean that. That's something I truly, truly believe. And I just want to make sure that your audience knows that too.
Well, thank you. That means a lot to me. Ari Hoffman, we'll have you back on Fridays with Friends in a few months. How does that sound?
Always a pleasure.
If you like this video, make sure to become an unDivided subscriber to help us grow this mission to give common sense a comeback. You can do that in 2 ways, at patreon.com/undivided, or by becoming a contributor on my locals community. Brandi Kruse, www.locals.com.
Thank you to the founding sponsor of unDivided, 1530 Mortgage. Visit them at 1530mortgage.com.